Welcome to our talk on fiscal policy. This lecture is going to complement our talk on monetary policy in terms of we're talking about macroeconomic policies that can be used to influence the business cycle. So, with monetary policy, fiscal the money supply was used to manipulate interest rates, and interest rates were in turn used to manipulate demand primarily through investment spending of the C plus I plus G plus NX. So when we talk about this, GDP has four components. In other words, there's four types of output. Output for households, we call it consumption goods. Output for businesses, primarily businesses, we call investment goods. Output for the government, goods and services. And then output for foreign consumption, NX. And this type of output is also different types of what we call demand. So aggregate demand is the same thing, Ci plus G plus Nx. In other words, the four different types of output represent the four different types of demand for that output. And so when we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about the government using their ability to tax and spend to impact this component of output and this component of spending. And so in the early part of the 20th century, the government didn't play much of a role at all because they spent very little and they employed very few people. But that changed in the latter part, and today the government employs over 4 million people and spends $3.7 trillion. Now, what allowed them to play such a bigger role? So in other words, this part went from a relatively small part of overall economic activity to roughly 20% of overall economic activity now. This is roughly 70%. This is roughly 15%. And as you could see, this is a minus 5%. That's because we're running a trade deficit, because this is exports, minus imports. And since imports are greater than exports, this is negative. So what allowed this to grow? What allowed G to grow? Well, basically, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, passed in 1913. That's when the federal government had the ability to tax income, which allowed a lot more money to come into the government coffers, which allowed them to spend more, which allowed them to play a bigger role in the economy. So today the government collects over $3 trillion in tax revenues. And to give you an idea, in 2014, the government brought in, through taxation and other things, but primarily taxation, $3 trillion. But you could see it spent more than that, which meant it ran a budget deficit of about $744 billion. When a government runs a budget deficit, that means it is stimulating the economy. This is a net injection into the income circular flow. So as we're going to see later on in this lecture, this is shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, which stimulates the economy, all else being equal. So, like I said before, government spending and government taxation affects demand. And aggregate demand, that's basically all of the demand for all goods and services in the economy. Now, the government also taxes people and gives that money to other people. We call this an income transfer. And income transfers don't affect the economy like deficit spending. Government transfers does not represent new output. When the government spends money on a good or service, that affects GDP. Income transfers, not directly. So, let's talk about how the federal government can alter aggregate demand. Well, either purchase more or fewer goods, or you raise or lower taxes. So, from a macro perspective, the federal government is a tool, the federal budget, excuse me, is a tool that can change aggregate demand. And when either aggregate demand or aggregate supply changes, that changes economic outcomes, primarily output and price levels. And we call this fiscal policy. So I like this diagram here because this over here, as you can see, this represents the economy right here. This is the economy. This is where the action takes place. And what you see here is this is the aggregate price level, and this is the aggregate output level. And then what we see here, we have a nice line that goes like this, a nice little axis that goes like this. And you can see that at this state of the economy, it's producing this much output, and its price level is this right here. Now, these are what we call economic outcomes. This is the inflation rate, and this is the level of output, or real GDP. Now, what if you don't like the equilibrium outcome? In other words, you don't like the price level, or you don't like the level of output. This level of output may be insufficient to put everyone to work. Well, the only way you're going to get a change in this is one of these two curves has got to shift to the right. And the things that can shift the curve are changes in determinants, either internal market forces. Let me kind of clean this up here. Internal market forces, that's let's say demographic changes as we get older, the baby boomers get older, their spending habits change, that alters supply and demand. That's an example of an internal market force. External shock, weather or terrorist attacks, that could shift either the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve. And then policy levers, and I'm sorry, this is in white here, this says fiscal policy. Either monetary or fiscal policy can be used to shift either the AD curve to the right or AS curve to the right. Now, a policy that shifts the AD curve, we call that demand side policy. A fiscal policy or monetary policy that shifts the AS curve, we call that supply side policy. And when these curves shift, it changes the level of output, so outcomes change. Obviously, the number of jobs changes, the inflation rate changes, economic growth changes, and international balances, that could mean net exports, that could change. So, in other words, you need some change here to impact the economy in order to get different outcomes. If there are no changes here, the market stays put right at this equilibrium level of price and equilibrium level of output. So we're talking about using this determinant to impact this, to change this. So let's give a scenario. Let's give a scenario where the economy is underperforming. In other words, the level of output is not enough to put everyone to work. In other words, we have cyclical unemployment going on in the economy. And let's, for the sake of argument, say the value of that output gap is $400 billion. So that's what we call the GDP gap. Sometimes this is called the recessionary gap. We're going to call it the GDP gap. And so that's definitely that's the difference of where we are, equilibrium level of output, and where we want to be, full employment level of output. And from a supply and demand point of view, here's your aggregate supply up here. Here's your aggregate demand right here. And you could see QE, that's where we are, $5.6 billion worth of output. And this is where we want to be, $6 trillion worth of output. That's what we call the GDP gap or recessionary gap. That's the $400 billion gap. We need to get the equilibrium level of output above QF. So one of these two curves, either the AS or the AD, has got to shift over to the right. And we're going to be focusing on this one, aggregate demand, shifting that over to the right. Now, some people would think that, do we shift it over by the amount of this GDP gap? Well, let's see. So from a Keynesian perspective, the way to get out of this predicament is to get more demand, shifting the AD curve. So when people say that you're a Keynesian, they're really saying that you're a demand side approach policymaker. And we could use fiscal stimulus, spend more money at the federal level or state or local level, or cut taxes. So how much do we want to shift that AD curve to the right? And then how do we actually induce that desired shift? And then in the next part 2 of this video series, we're going to be answering these two questions.